This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. Every week, Gilad and I, together or separately, talk to authors about books and research that we find interesting and important. You can always support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and clicking the Patreon button, or go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. Even a little goes a long way. I'm pleased to welcome our two guests today, in alphabetical order. David Makovsky is a Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Director of the Project on Arab-Israel Relations, and of the Program on U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. Before joining YNEP, as we sometimes call it, Makovsky was an award-winning journalist who covered the peace process from 1989 to 2000 as executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, and special Jerusalem correspondent for the U.S. News and World Report. He's also the host of a new podcast called Decision Points, the U.S.-Israel Relations. Check it out. Ambassador Dennis Ross is William Davidson Distinguished Fellow Counselor of the Program on the U.S.-Israel Strategic Relationship. He served under 4 American leaders, including President Obama, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan. He was a special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process, helping Israelis and Palestinians reach the 1995 interim agreement, the 1997 Hebron Accord. He facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty and worked intensively to bring Israel and Syria together. Ambassador Ross and Makovsky are the co-authors of a new book called Be Strong and Good Courage: How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, published by Public Affairs in September 2019. David and Dennis, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
You write that this book was conceived with a very clear purpose in mind. It's not just a theoretical inquiry or a history book, although it is all of those. This is a book with a message. Can you describe that message?
Israel is facing a looming choice, and that looming choice is if it stays on the current path it's on, by default it becomes one state for two people. This is not even a demographic argument, although we can get into the demographics. The reality today, if Israel stays where it is, the number of Jews and Arabs in Israel and the West Bank is about 6-4. So if it just stays as it is, even if there wasn't going to be a certain trend demographically, you already would have one state for two people.
Is that including Gaza or not?
It does not include Gaza because Israel got out of Gaza. I think the two of us feel whatever one questions about Gaza, and there are issues related to Gaza. You can't have it both ways. You can't say Israel has to leave territories, and then when it does, then you don't count it. So we don't include Gaza. We're just talking about Israel and the West Bank, and even there, the ratio is roughly 6-4. So if it's 6-4, it becomes one state for two people, unless Israel can, in fact, preserve the possibility of separation. So the ability to separate Israelis from Palestinians physically. If Israel keeps building outside of the settlement blocks, then the ability to separate disappears. So the key for this, from our standpoint, what we were thinking about in doing this book was to focus very heavily on, right, Israel is facing a tough choice, not because it's so tough in terms of making a decision in the abstract, but because politically the weight of the settler movement in Israel is such that any political leader, any leader of Israel today will have to make a decision if it's going to stop building outside the settlement blocks, even if it keeps building within the blocks. If it's going to stop building outside the settlement blocks, the consequence is going to be a real backlash from the settlers. Now that takes courage. It takes wisdom, hence the title, Be Strong and of Good Courage. And we thought one way to sort of get at this is to look historically at Israel's past leaders who demonstrated both those characteristics, who were not afraid to take on their political basis if that was what required, who always put the state first and not their politics, and thought perhaps that could provide both a guide but also a source of inspiration. So we wanted to, as a point of departure, we wanted to focus on, all right, what is the looming choice that has to be made? Yes, it's politically difficult. Is there, in a sense, lessons from the past that can be drawn upon that can provide, in a sense, a pathway to the future.
Thank you, Dennis. You pinpoint the lack of big decision-making today. It seems like there's a bit of an accusation in this book that for a long time Israeli leaders have not been able to make the big decisions needed. How did Israel get to that situation?
Go through the transcripts within a week of the Six-Day War. And, reading them in Hebrew, it was like you couldn't put this down. And you realize the decision was not to decide. It became too contentious. Menachem Begin, who we write about, was actually the one who was one of the leading advocates against a decision to return the territories as a part of a peace deal. Although, ironically, with the birth of the Palestinian Authority, everyone points to Begin and autonomy and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
We're going to talk about that, definitely.
Right, the imprimatur of this. But the decision not to decide was really basically, it comes within a week of the Six-Day War. And this has become Israel's Cold War. It has become the defining issue. If in America, when we say right, left, we're talking about the role of government in society. That means high taxes, low taxes. The Cold War in Israel since 1967 has been over the issue of territorial withdrawal.
So you're saying the indecisiveness started already in 1967, and it's not a feature of one of Israel's leaders?
No, it really was. It was built in because it was based on the stalemate within. It wasn't like they all had a consensus, let's all agree not to decide. No, they were divided. Eshkol felt that adding all these new people and about 5 or 6 other ministers would be the end of Zionism even, that he said, we don't need more people, don't need more land. He was the prime minister. But there was another bloc. You had Dayan also, who was a more functionalist, and Begin and others who felt that this was a mistake. So this indecision wasn't a grand strategy, but it was a function of the division within, and that division has been a permanent feature of Israel since really within the first week of the Six-Day War.
Right. I want to also get at your big concern that no solution will lead to what you talk about, a binational outcome. But what if it's not a binational outcome? What if it's an Israeli-dominated, Jewish-dominated outcome in which the Arabs are either a minority or citizens, let's say, who are second-class citizens or not even citizens? Isn't that also a possible outcome?
It is, but that's then the end of the Zionist mission, the Zionist ethic, and the identity of Israel as a Jewish democratic state. I mean, it is very interesting that when you look at Ben-Gurion, actually when you look at all 4 of these leaders, they wanted Israel to retain its character, but they also wanted Israel to be a light unto the nations. And the reality is, if Israel loses that character, loses that identity, not only is it the end of the Zionist mission, but think about the implications of this even here and what it will mean for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. If Israel becomes one state for 2 people, and in a sense it becomes governed by 2 different legal structures, in a sense 2 different classes of citizens, the mantra on the Palestinian side is going to be one person, one vote, equal rights. That will resonate in the United States. If you think that BDS, whose real purpose is not about ending occupation, it's about ending Israel. It's about delegitimization of Israel. If you think BDS was a problem, it's nothing compared to what a mantra of one person, one vote will be when one state is the only outcome. And I think that, no one should kid themselves about what the longer-term implications of that are.
Is that a mantra, or is it a legitimate claim if there's a one-state, Jewish-dominated outcome?
Well, when I say mantra, I don't mean to discredit the mantra. I meant to say it is basically a repeatable slogan that people will hear and say, well, of course, who is going to disagree with that? In the United States, you're going to find not just the progressive wing of the Democratic Party raising basic questions about Israel. This will spread across the political spectrum. And whatever, no matter how important it is for Israel to be able to defend itself by itself, which we both subscribe to, the truth is the 2 of us are strong supporters of Israel. It's because we worry about the future that we're calling attention to this, and we're saying, look, we understand you face tangible threats. We know what's going on in Syria with Iran embedding itself, with the effort to create precision-guided rocket capability. We understand there's 130,000 Hezbollah rockets. We understand there's ISIS in the Sinai. We understand the U.S. is increasingly withdrawing from the region. We understand this presents Israel with real threats. Those are tangible. What we're talking about may seem abstract, but it's a real threat to Israel's identity. And the consequence of that will be felt for a long time, and it will affect the U.S.-Israeli relationship. And whatever anybody thinks, the only true friend Israel has had in the world is the United States.
Okay, but having said that, the book is really about internal Israeli dynamics. You're not making an argument that you need to do this for the sake of the relationship. You're saying you need to do this because look at how Israeli leaders in the past have shaped Israel's destiny. And I want to sort of go into the way you structure those chapters, which is heavily focused at points on the biographical background of these four major leaders, Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon. What did you find when you went through their biographical backgrounds again? I mean, many of these people have long biographies, multiple biographies written about them. How did you try to build their history and personalities in ways that focus or lead up to their decision-making?
Look, I think each of them, we wanted to trace their journeys to decision. And the fact that they were willing to have this, had a sense of profiles and courage, a sense of political courage to stand up to political allies to making tough decisions. Look, each of them, maybe with the exception of Begin, really underwent their own transformation before their decision. That was what we found. They were different in many ways.
David, that's a great point that you mentioned that. I'm going to stop you because I really was interested in this transformation point. Did you weren't looking for that when you started?
We weren't, no, but it just became clear that, Ben-Gurion, when he starts, until the Peel Commission of 1937, he thinks the Jewish state will be everywhere. And he comes to the view it's better to have full control over some of the land than to have less than full control over all of the land. And this idea of partition, which starts with Peel in 37, it goes to the UN Partition Plan in 47. And there were different stations along the way, Zionist congresses, where he had to stand up for this idea. And some of his closest confidants, like Beryl Katzenelson, Tabankin, some of these guys were not with him on this. And he felt that this is all about Jewish sovereignty. And the land, about where the land is less significant. So that was a transformation he went through himself. In the case of Rabin and Sharon, and Dennis really focused on those chapters, they each didn't come to Palestinian nationalism from their birth. They each underwent a journey that this is country first. You have to put that above your personal interest. And look, Rabin paid with his life. Sharon has a stroke right after that, but says...
Oh, you think his political decisions brought him to the stroke?
No, that I don't know. But this idea of him talking about occupation did not come naturally to him as he in the Gaza debate. So they all underwent transformation. Even Begin, where, he wasn't ideologically opposed to the Sinai being returned, but he knew he'd be attacked on, once you give up settlers in northern Sinai, you've set a precedent for the West Bank. You've given up strategic depth. And even with all this, that he fought for it, because he thought if I could take Egypt out of the war coalition, there's no wars with states. They weren't focused on Hamas and Hezbollah, non-state actors in those days. But Begin had this sense that Zionism and civil liberties are reconcilable. And some of his ideas, which start in that same cabinet decisions that I was talking to you about before, within days of the 1967 war, he thought that the Arab Palestinians, he didn't call them Palestinians, he said the RVA, Eretz Yisrael, the Arabs of the land of Israel, should vote. Because in 1871, Bismarck gave the vote to people in Alsace-Lorraine who were French citizens. He had this sense of civil liberties. He gives a speech in the Knesset when he produces his autonomy plan. He goes, this will not be Rhodesia here. And he really wanted to make sure that Zionism and civil liberties were fully reconcilable. So this, each one of these people chose a path that was not popular with their base. These are people that chose their country over their base. They did not sanctify their political base. They put their country first. When the national interests and the personal interests were in a collision, it was clear that the national interests had to go first.
But did you also feel in building the biographical structure that you wanted to really show how committed they were to their earlier positions through their lifelong achievements and then change, to kind of build their credibility and then change their mind? Did you feel that was necessary?
No, it was no doubt. And hear from Dennis. We wanted the first part of each chapter, a good half of it often, to really give you a sense of where they're coming from. What was in their kishka, where was their gut? because you can't understand where the end of the journey is unless you understand the beginning of their journey.
Yeah, I would just say you can't really show a transformation, even though I have to say it's true. We didn't start off with the premise that there'll be a transformation. We discovered it as we went through it, which is interesting for the both of us, because this is a kind of journey for the two of us as well.
Did you go through a transformation thinking about this?
Well, I think we went through, I think together we went through a deeper understanding of what we thought we already knew. That happens, I think, with most books. You have a pretty good sense going into it. You also may feel that you understand the history well, but there's nothing like delving deeply into it to actually discover there's more there than you realized. And in this case, we discovered more of a transformation than I think that either one of us anticipated.
I think that's fascinating. And I want to pick up on something you mentioned before, David, about Begin. Not to in any way take away from the massive, towering achievement of the Camp David Accords and the agreement with Egypt, which has been a remarkably enduring peace. But regarding the Palestinian issue, which is the focus of your book, it's an interesting kind of fine line. He sort of acknowledges the need for them to have civil rights, while never quite going the distance to allow for national rights, calling them Arabs rather than Palestinians. What was that? Why not? Do you think that he was just not able to see the historic reality, or was it a lacuna in his own decisiveness? Why wasn't he able to go that far?
I think he felt he wanted to give them the right to vote. No prime minister to his left or to his right, either before or afterwards,
certainly not afterwards,
was willing to give Palestinians and West Bank a right to vote in Israeli elections.
No, it seems radical left today, but even still, it's not national recognition.
He wanted to have them the right buy land purchases in Israel. And Aaron Barak was one of the people who was his legal advisor, who's considered the father, the conceptual father of the liberal revolution in Israel.
We forget that because, of course, the right thinks that Aaron Barak is now like the great Satan, that he was actually nurtured by Begin.
Right. And so he was someone who believed, look, as long as I'm giving them full rights as individuals. And this is a guy who was one of the first Israelis to come out against martial law that was going on in Israeli Arab areas till 1966. And he said, this is wrong if they're citizens. He genuinely believed that there would be a way to maintain the Jewish majority. So as long as he was doing one of two things, the National Party he didn't believe in because he thought this was biblical patrimony, and it was like almost illegitimate, not just ill-advised to go that right. But as long as he gave them full rights as Israelis, then he wasn't doing anything that could be assailed from any direction. So he didn't see this, in a negative way. I mean, people forget, but when he presented his plan to Carter in December 1977, he actually had an excellent meeting. Carter actually thought that he had traveled the distance. It was right after there was a euphoria of the Sadat visit, but it wasn't just the euphoria. He saw the plan. He said, you really do want to give them full rights. And, of course, then the relationship goes downhill, which is a whole other story. But I do think that Begin, he didn't see this as a nationalist terms. It's just so ironic that every prime minister after Begin, or after Oslo, I should say, they all invoked Menachem Begin when he talked about the legitimate rights of the Palestinians. And it's just ironic that the Carter people who wrote their memoirs in the 80s, they didn't see Oslo in the 90s. And so they assailed Begin for thinking narrowly about protecting his interests, when in fact in the Israeli domestic dynamic, Begin's autonomy becomes the template and the imprimatur, really, for every Israeli leader since, to justify it.
What's interesting here is that when you look at Begin, you see someone who has a very deep core set of beliefs and principles. But he also has the capacity, when the principles and reality come into conflict, he makes the pragmatic choice. So again, when he makes the decision to withdraw 100% from the Sinai, to accept the removal of the settlements, to speak about the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, in a sense, he begins to challenge not just his own base and the people who are closest to him, who call him a betrayer. He has a choice to make. And when the choice is there and he has to face what he considers to be the real needs of the country, it's not just the base. Even in a sense, he's able to make adjustments in terms of his own ideology. It's interesting that of the four, he's the only one who isn't speaking about, look, we have to preserve a Jewish democratic state, because for him, that's part of who he is.
There was no question about the democracy
Right.
part of it.
That's just a given. For the others, they're focused more on the demographics, and therefore they say, okay, here's what we have to do. You have, after the War of Independence, you have David Ben-Gurion saying explicitly, we could have taken the land to the Jordan River, but then we would have been a minority in a larger country. We preferred to be a majority with less territory. You have Ariel Sharon, before he makes his decision on disengagement, he writes a speech for the annual anniversary on Begin at Sde Boker, where he quotes that language. And then he says, right after he quotes the language, he says, we have historic decisions that we're facing. This is in his mind. Right. And Rabin tells me in February of 1995, he tells me he's going to build a separation fence. And the reason he says he's going to build it, we're just sitting alone, just the two of us. He says, I don't know if we can reach an agreement with the Palestinians. I hope we can produce partition through an agreement, but I don't know if we can. And if we can't, I will ensure separation because we must retain who we are as a Jewish democratic state. So in a sense, they're all bound by this. One, it's the way he breathes. And so it never even occurs to him. For the others, they're looking at this very closely.
I mean, I didn't intend for us to spend so much time on Begin, but in a way, you guys are making the argument about why we are, because he set that tone. And there's another question I want to ask about him.
One more thing
sure.
on Begin, as long as you're talking about it.
No, my next question is still about Begin.
Really? Oh, I was just going to say that he does have this sense going back to 1944. And I was not someone who came as predisposed to, see this, but I was struck by it, going back to the Saison when, the Haganah people started turning in the Begin people, the Irgun people, and someone said, let's start killing Haganah people. And he lifts up this thin sheet of paper and he says, you could have a just cause, but the distance between a just cause and a contaminated cause is as thin as a piece of paper. And ultimately, this idea of at a certain point you have to subordinate your ideological attachments to the national good. And that, I think, defines him ultimately. And when he makes the case, when he makes the decision to give up the Sinai, and he said, look, we've been fighting wars here every few years since 1948 with Egypt. If we could save lives, I think it's worth the price. And I will live to my dying breath believing that.
Right.
And he was someone ultimately, for whatever his ideological attachments were, which were deep, ultimately it was the national interest, I think, that defined him.
But you pit these two together as if there's values and pragmatism. And in another point in the book, what struck me in the chapter about Begin, you wrote that he had this vision not that might makes right, but that being in the moral right translates into physical right. And I see that as an incorporation of a value system within his ideas. But today, if you were to talk about morality in Israeli politics, you get somewhere between ridiculed and called a traitor. Where has that value system and way of thinking and decision-making gone?
The book opens with Ariel Sharon and me having lunch. And he says during the course of that lunch at a certain point, all my successors are politicians. And what he meant by that is that they won't make the hard decisions, they'll make purely political decisions. Now, I think in answer to your question, one of the things that happens over time is that you begin to have leaders who aren't shaped by the founding of the state. They had to fight for the state was fragile. You had leaders like Ben-Gurion and Begin for whom the issue of values was really a centerpiece of who they were. You have people like Rabin and Sharon who say, okay, we fought for the state. We were there when the state was really fragile. In some ways, Israel, for those who become the later leaders, they become those who are more distant from what were those founding principles, and maybe you make decisions on a day-to-day basis and you're driven by what is the immediate need as opposed to, all right, what are some enduring truths about who we are? And I think there's this tendency in Israel not to look like you're a friar, a sucker, not to look like you're naive. And somehow that has tended to, I think, trump these more traditional values.
I would add back to something Dennis said before, about what's abstract and what's tangible. And sometimes the urgent crowds out the significant.
Or the politically expedient.
Or the expedient crowds out the truly important. When you have, Hamas, to your west, and you have Hezbollah to your north, and you have Iran to your east, suddenly the day-to-day grinding of this conflict just erodes this sense of values. It's seen as too abstract. It's almost a luxury that you can't afford because survival always takes, the front seat. And these politicians absorb that. And that's part of the grinding of the conflict.
Okay, but you're still talking about context, and I'm still thinking about the personalities and how they think and make their decisions. And another very interesting anecdote, Dennis, I want to ask you about Yitzhak Rabin. You have this anecdote. It's in a footnote. Too bad it's not in the text, about Rabin admitting when he was wrong about something. Tell us the anecdote, and then I want to really understand what kind of leader is able to admit he's wrong these days.
Well, the short answer is I've worked for quite a few.
Well, good. I'm glad that they're around.
No, I've said I've worked for quite a few leaders. I didn't say I've worked for quite a few who have admitted.
Oh, I guess I heard what I wanted to hear.
No, what separated Rabin is that Rabin was, first of all, completely honest. He couldn't tell a lie. Just was who he was. He literally could not lie. But he was also intellectually honest. And he was the most analytical leader that I ever worked with, by far. Everything, he would think it through, and it would be A, B, C, D, E. There was a kind of pristine logic to it. And when he thought it through, you couldn't move him. So the anecdote, and there were more than one, but I'll give you the one that you're referring to. He was defense minister, and he comes to Washington about 10 days after the beginning of the first Intifada. I was on the National Security Council staff at that point. I had known him for a few years already. And so I was actually the first to meet him when he came. And I raised with him the issue of what was going on with the Palestinians. And he basically was dismissive. He said, they won't stick with it. We'll be very tough in response. You'll see they won't stick with it. We've seen things like this before. It'll go away. It'll go away soon. And I said, I don't think so. I said, I was traveling through the West Bank. I was actually forced to leave a refugee camp, which is kind of unheard of for wanting, having an American official there and creating a disturbance, and we were forced to leave. And I said, there's something deeper going on. I just think there's a deeper level of frustration you may not be picking up. And he said, no, you'll see. A couple months later, when I saw him, I didn't raise anything. He said to me, you were right and I was wrong.
I just can't imagine an Israeli leader, and it's hard for me to imagine the American leader or many other leaders admitting that. Do you think that's a personality quality that allows for the kind of transformation of ideas that you've been tracking in the book? Well,
I do, because I think I won't say that all four of them would have been inclined to do this, but I will say this, that what joins all of them, they see the world as it is. They don't engage in wishful thinking. They're able to constantly assess reality as reality evolves. David was talking before about Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion undergoes a huge change in terms of what he thinks can happen. I think each of them does it, or they wouldn't be able to transform themselves. I mean, look at Sharon. This is a guy who built all the settlements. There's one anecdote in the chapter here where in 2003 someone looked at the map, the original map that he laid out for the grid for settlements in 1977, and they realized everything was done to follow what he originally conceived of. Not for ideological reasons, for security reasons. But when he comes to believe that the circumstances have changed for Israel, then he's the one who says, okay, then I'm going to have to change too.
Important point for these leaders is that how they really let reality in the door. And they let that shape their thinking. And they thought about, okay, what are the risks of action, but what are the risks of inaction? What if we don't act? For Ben-Gurion, it was, what if we don't declare the state? If we cannot justify a state when the British are leaving, we'll never be able to justify it. And we have a shot now, even though his generals were saying to him, wait for a few months, we'll be better positioned if we have a ceasefire. He saw a lot of other dynamics in the region. Marshall was against the state. He felt that there was a now or never dimension to it. And he said, what are the risks if we don't act? And Begin, what if I turn down Sadat? He rejoins the rejectionist camp. There's another war. We will lose the sympathy of the United States that will say we were the obstacle to peace, the sympathy of American Jews. And in the case of Rabin and Sharon, each time they had this intellectual honesty where they felt they had to be guided by the reality as they saw it and not as they would like to see it. And the issue of what are the risks if they don't act, that was important.
Okay, I want to do something that I don't normally do, and that is challenge you from the right, which is that aren't you defining this sense of strategy and analysis and responsibility to act from a perspective that Israel needs to reach a two-state solution? And couldn't one also make the exact opposite argument? This is that Netanyahu, who's not really named in the book in an analytic sense, but is kind of looming over this book, from his perspective, thinks that I have analyzed everything, I see what's going on, and this is a situation where conquering and settling and possessing the territory is a historic decision as well, not an indecision. Maybe he is a historic leader, and after all, I want to remind you that the title of your book is taken from the book of Joshua, and a few verses later, God commands Joshua to go and conquer the territory. So what do you say to that?
Well, it goes back to the premise of the book. One state for two people means the end of the Zionist ethic. One state for two people means that the Palestinians will say, okay, one person, one vote, equal rights. That will pose a strategic threat to Israel. And the truth is, look around the Middle East. Every place you have a state where there's more than one identity, national, sectarian, or tribal, that state's at war. So if what you want is a kind of perpetual conflict, if what you want is to lose Israel's character, if what you want is to lose the United States, then by all means, then you should go ahead and you should be pushing for a one-state outcome. The problem is, those in Israel who prefer one state have a very clear concept of it. Those Palestinians who prefer one state have a very opposite concept of it. What's clear is you have two national movements competing for the same space, two national identities. Therefore, two states for two peoples is the right answer eventually. Now, we will both say eventually because even if you want two states, it's not possible anytime soon. And by the way, that's not principally because of Israel. It's principally because of the Palestinians. They are divided, not just between Gaza and the West Bank, but between Hamas and Fatah. They have two very different concepts. Hamas does not accept Israel and won't accept Israel. The PA accepts the principle of two states, except they don't accept Israel as the state of the Jewish people.
Right, and conjuring Israel's right-wing arguments today, wouldn't they say, yes, they're divided, they're weakened, their national identity is crumbling, their political sort of trajectory and sociology is fragmenting them. They will drop these national demands. They were never really committed to it anyway. They will accept living better like Arab Israeli citizens. Why should we go for this two-state solution? I mean, this is what you hear all the time from Israeli politicians.
If there's one emblem of the Palestinian national movement, which is a very self-destructive emblem, by the way, it's resistance. It's defiance.
Sumud.
So when Arafat comes back from Camp David, Arafat is a hero, goes and is cheered because he resisted the United States, he resisted Israel. At the same time that he's doing that in public, guess what he's doing in private? He's sending a letter to Clinton saying, Camp David was the greatest thing since the peace process began. Let's have another summit. We can get there. Now, the reality is that Palestinians will unite around resistance, even if it's self-destructive, because it's the power of the weak.
But the one thing they'll never do is drop their national identity, is what you're saying.
They won't give up the national identity. The idea that they'll surrender it, they'll take it's interesting, those on the right, sort of have two contradictory arguments. They'll surrender it on the one hand. On the other hand, they'll say, look, they never give up. They'll always reject us. Now, you can't have it both ways. You can't say they'll always reject us on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're ready to surrender.
I would just say, when we say they won't give up their national identity, we're not saying they're always going to push for a state, because we think they might channel it towards a vote in Israel.
Absolutely.
So when the people on the right say they'll be like Israeli Arabs, are they willing to give them the vote? They're not. That's disingenuous for these people to say they're not willing to make them citizens. And that's what we're warning against, our fear. People use this term one state solution to mean completely different things. When the settlers say one state, they mean Israel dominates everything. When people at the left edge of the spectrum say one state, that means no Israel. Our point is that one state, however you configure it, is not a recipe for solving conflict. If you look at Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, these multi-ethnic states, the conflict is just the guns are turned inward because the primordial loyalty is towards the ethnic group and not to a sense of citizenship. I mean, I wish Montesquieu...
Except for maybe now with the new emerging Lebanese identity with the protests.
We'll see. Montesquieu, Rousseau, all these leaders that, talk about citizenship, has not been, Middle Eastern is not post-nationalist that way. And if India and Pakistan, if India and Pakistan come back together, maybe we should have a conversation. But we don't see that happening. And so what we worry about is that Israel is going to be increasingly isolated. And we see this as a warning call. But we think that people need to be inspired by leaders who actually met the bar of history because they were thinking about these same demographic issues that Israel faces today.
Okay, we have to end soon. I want to ask you one final question, which is a difficult question, but I think it's legitimate. You have both devoted your lives to this issue in a way. You're two American Jews. Ultimately, you're not citizens there. If Israel decides on this path, which you consider to be self-destructive, you've made your case for why it shouldn't. What could American Jews or should American Jews or anybody else say about it who are not part of the Israeli body politic?
Well, so let me put it this way. When it comes to war-peace issues, American Jews have no say and should have no say. As soon as their kids and their grandkids are serving in the IDF, they can have a say. But when it comes to the identity of Israel, they have a say. Why? Israel describes itself as the state of the Jewish people. So if Israel is the state of the Jewish people, then the Jewish people ought to be able to have a say in terms of that identity. And if they're adopting a position that will end it being the state of the Jewish people, well, then the Jewish people actually on the outside have a vote. So here, we say this in the book at the end, and when I'm out speaking to audiences, I say, every Jewish organization, every head of Jewish organization, every synagogue delegation that goes, everybody who goes when you go individually, ask your counterparts in Israel, what are you doing to prevent Israel from becoming one state for two people?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way of saying you can't have it both ways. You can't be both the state of the Jewish people and reject the input of the Jewish people. However, since we're all people who consider words very carefully, we know that Netanyahu and in general the right-wing demand in the peace process in recent years has been a Jewish state, not the language of the state of for the Jewish people and maybe other citizens, of course. So the Jewish state concept doesn't necessarily mean it's a state of all the Jewish people.
Well, he certainly says publicly that Israel's the state of the Jewish people.
He definitely uses that theme as well.
Yes.
So I guess it depends on which Netanyahu we're talking about. Any final thoughts? What's going to be the turning point here?
Well, we'll see. As we have this conversation, the coalition negotiations are going on.
And they probably still will be.
And they might be, and who knows if there's a third round or not. Look, maybe because writing this book about leaders where reality does protrude, and you can't have reality going all in one place and the narrative all in another place. I do think that that there's going to have to be some way to deal with this. I mean, that look, you might not be able to hit the home run ball, as we say in America.
You often don't talk about peace, I should say. You often write two-state outcome.
Right,
that must have been conscious.
And also separation. Look, we're talking about more a direction than a destination because we are concerned that that if we don't talk about a direction, what if it's all or nothing in the Mideast? It's always nothing, and we're worried about these all or nothing, and therefore we're more gradualists than believing this situation is going to be transformed tomorrow. But there's just too much history and too little geography. No one is going away in this conflict. Reality will insist that this issue is dealt with in some regard. We hope it's dealt with in the right way. But you're not going to be able to ignore this issue. And we're not here to leave the Palestinians off the hook at all. We write in the book.
You're clear about that in the book.
We make clear in the book that we don't see all the onus as on Israel at all. But the Zionist ethos has always been this element of, taking, your future in your hands. That's what defined the founders, that they were not waiting, for someone else to save them, to extricate them. They felt their Zionism meant being proactive. And we think this spirit of Zionism, we have hope and belief that this spirit of Zionism, of being proactive, means that this issue is going to have to be addressed. Maybe not in a transformative way, maybe in a gradualist way. It might be a single, not a home run, but we just believe this issue is too big. Israel's character is too big. The Zionist airplane has always been about two wings, Jewish and democratic. You can't fly a plane on one wing. I'm hopeful, and I think Dennis hopeful, that Zionism that has succeeded in grappling with some mega challenges since before its birth will find that same pragmatic spirit of addressing this issue.
Okay, on the hope that reality will prevail, that's Ambassador Dennis Ross and David Makovsky talking about their new book, Be Strong and Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. Thanks also to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers, and to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to consider writing us a review. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. If you like us, also like us on Facebook. The Tel Aviv Review podcast Ideas from Israel. That's the name of our page. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.